obviously I've listened to some wonderful, coherent, structured, intelligible papers. So this is a chance to encounter the unstructured and the chaotic. There's quite a lot of leaping around from kind of one metaphorical stab to another, so I apologise in advance. I think the main thing to do is always to begin with a clip. I think you'll know this clip. Esther and Charisse walking, and they walk in the park, and after a while, as Cousin says, this happens, which is great. That's enough, really. I love this passage. I'm sure you must all know it very well because it's the bandwagon. They're walking through Central Park by night. They encounter some dancers and they walk through them but don't dance. And their steps are, I don't know if you've noticed, but they're so precisely judged because we need to get the sense that they're not dancing. And if you look closely, replay is a great thing. You can see that Esther makes minute adjustments to make sure that their stepping is always absolutely arrhythmical in a really nice way, not too clear, not too overtly, but just absolutely precisely. And of course, eventually Charisse cracks and does something graceful and dance-like with her leg that suddenly shatters this utility, this moment of walking utility. It's a small gesture, and of course Esther is freed to join her, and what they do after that is obviously superb. But my delight in this sequence is about this passage from not dancing to dancing, and I'm wondering how it's signalled. How do we know that they're not dancing and then they are dancing? Is it about this rhythm aspect? Are we supposed to clock that? Even they're walking, it's not exactly like anybody else is walking, so even that is kind of suspect, but nevertheless different. The music, which I didn't play, obviously gives us quite a lot. It's a great score, a great film. So how do we know when they do start dancing that we're watching dance film as opposed to, say, documentary? It feels like a fantasy sequence. Obviously the studio bound conditions and so many other aspects of it. So I suppose a question for me as a filmmaker really is, I saw this when I was young and I've loved it ever since. Is dance on screen always a kind of flight from reality, which is the way it's so often presented? Just to sideline, Busby Berkeley was famous. He would delete the atmos when the dance began, and so many other filmmakers have followed suit. And what happens to the film frame is always something that kind of intrigues me, because you often have a sense of it. It varies. It's sometimes apparent, sometimes not so apparent. And does the break into dance change that? And also the dancers' bodies themselves, the body of Esther and the body of Charisse. Are they over there, or do they come closer when the dancing starts, or do they recede? How does that kind of work? Because obviously those are matters of great importance, and the possibility of dance in film, that would be quite intriguing to look at. Therefore, about which space, what kind of a space is it that we're invited to experience? And of course, questions, if you're making the movement, the passage from narrative to dance, a question will arise inevitably about impulses and motives and thought, imagined thought in these, to what extent are they kind of, people with no motive? Are they just kind of automata, or are we imagining that there's things going on inside them? The dance expresses feelings, we like to say, and can be charged with emotion. But I wonder, to what extent is the audience sitting there thinking, there's a vast multitude behind the camera, making everything nice for us. So is it when they're walking and then they're dancing, the question might arise, it certainly does for me, is that Tony Hunter, oh, and then it's Fred Astaire, or is it always Fred Astaire, or is it Tony Hunter and then Tony Hunter dances, Tony Hunter being the character he plays. And if I knew that he was very angry the day they did that take, would that change anything for me? So quite, the move into dance is not so straightforward for me. Because obviously I was planning to move into shooting dance, and it was a while ago, but I remember vividly the decision to make, to start working with dance. I was and I thought I'd run through some of that for you. Partly, of course, as vanity. Of course, I thought I could make the best dance film. I could reveal something about dance on film that no one else could. So that's obviously, everybody's always proved wrong on that count. But it was enough to get me out of bed on the day of the first piece of filming. It is a challenge and challenging and complex business, filming dance, because you have to. You also have this responsibility to hand something on to the viewer, the eventual viewer, that somehow comes from over there that you want to give to over there, and you've got to do that competently and hand it on. And the other thing, of course, is, it's like the vanity aspect of it as well, is that, certainly at that time, video was, not many choreographers were using it. Some, obviously well-known people had, but a choreographer like Jonathan Burrows at the time didn't have ready access to video and didn't really sort of feel quite confident to use it. So I thought, well, if I filmed his work, then maybe that would help in the process of a critique of the choreography and would help with the overall project and process of making new dance. But obviously, many choreographers now routinely use video as a way of memorising, learning, passing on, and restructuring and editing their own work. So that's happening now, but it wasn't then. And the other thing was, I thought, well, I would come along and I would offer a totally compelling naivety, which no one else in his company would have, because they were all trained and practiced dancers. Everybody around there was besotted with dance. I knew Jonathan because I met him, and we would behave badly on the whole together in other ways, so which is a treat, but it did mean I came into his work from a different direction to so many other people that he was talking with. As a filmmaker, what would be my task? To find the ideal point of view, to somehow put the camera miraculously in the right place so that anyone watching a film would suddenly see the best possible representation. Of course, I might have to decide whether to adopt a single point of view or to allow myself to move the camera around. Mostly Astaire, he famously had a contract which said the camera would always be, as it were, front and centre, and it would follow him absolutely meticulously, and he would always be head to foot, and there would be no other framings allowed. And he even had a special dolly to make sure the camera was always free in the way it needed to be to follow. I've seen photographs of the so-called Astaire dolly, and it's quite low angle, but it wasn't a conventional way of moving cameras around at the time on a Hollywood set. So points of view is quite important. So I was assuming I could do something, I could put the essence of something onto screen and make it visible to people. And I even thought maybe I'd make something visible that wasn't otherwise visible. I didn't know, but I thought I would see. Of course, I was struck straight away by dance being a kind of, because it's, you sit there and you watch it and you can't stop it, you can't pause it. So there's a sense in which you're absolutely overwhelmed by the experience. It never stops. It's a headlong thing, rushed through time, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that was striking. So the other thing film is supposed to be able to do, apart from arrest that headlong flow, maybe by slowing down or repeating, is it can also look closely. And lots of people have thought to do that. Also, I was, challenged by the fact that I was going to be offering a two-dimensional flat image based on something that was, of course, in depth. So that's quite difficult. On the other hand, it seems very simple. You just point a camera at some dance, you switch the camera on, and people dance, and you've got a dance film. So, what's complicated about it? It didn't seem like, with Sylvie Guillaume or Fred Astaire, it seems like you could just switch on the camera and sure enough people will watch, and they do. So what was there really fundamentally for a filmmaker, what is of interest there? And I suppose I also was setting out thinking, well, maybe I could learn something about film generally for myself, because I would have the chance to free myself of the obligation to deal with dialogue or that interactions of those kinds of verbal or gestural kinds in a plausible, naturalistic drama setting. So, as I said, purpose. I was really quite intrigued and excited by the thought that dancing bodies, I'm going to call them that, don't seem to have a purpose. So, in a drama situation, as I say, you're dealing with character and dialogue, motivation, all those sorts of things. The marvellous thing about this is really you don't have to think about, why does he move his left leg forward slightly at that point? Why is he doing that? What's going on in his head? You don't have to deal with that. And dancers are not stuck in causal chains, so it's not that you don't have to offer a plausible explanation for every action. They can go from A to B, and nobody's going to ask why did they go from A to B. They don't need to be cause and effect. Dance, I was straight away, I kind of always knew it. It gets my attention without me knowing necessarily the language. So, I didn't quite, when I was young and saw Astaire and Charisse, I didn't know anything about the origin of this style of dance. And when I first saw the contemporary dance that I started to see with Jonathan, I wasn't really aware of the history. I knew nothing of the background. I've obviously learned a lot more since then, but it got my attention. So, and I'll come back to this later, but it's interesting that it came up this morning about this statues. I'll come back to that, but it had a lot to do around this sort of question of the contrast between moving and not moving. And it also it led me into thinking, because today's theme is about contact with other media. I was struck from that dance activated a thought about the relationship between portrait and landscape as two kind of notions from painting and image making. And there's something about the dancer in a space that there's a ritualistic quality about what went on that drew me in. There's something about the space that kind of almost, it seemed to me straight away, there's something here, there's a kind of sanctification of this space here by their actions. That clearing there that they kind of walk into and then inhabit. And not only do they kind of just come into it, they actually make it their own, they define it. Dancers do actually talk about making space themselves. So with actors and doing drama, it never seemed to me that that sort of thing happened. So it was unusual. So I came to the conclusion, almost straight away, I jumped to the conclusion that space was invoked by framing dance with a camera, and it was an intensely theatrical kind of gesture or phenomenon, and that I wasn't looking at a pretense of the real. It was a showing or a presenting, and not an illusionist kind of attempt to represent or draw you into a plausible situation. And I love the fact that a dancer in the viewfinder, which is one of the great pleasures for a filmmaker, is not impersonating anyone. They appear as themselves in a really important way. That I concluded that wasn't Tony Hunter, that was Fred Astaire. And I was also struck by some other things. I think I might just have a little pause, it's because it's a slight change of theme. So everybody in front of the camera, this is a more general sort of idea that I had at the time. Everyone that's in front of the camera can do what they have just done again. They can do it and redo it any number of times. As long as you ask them to, they will, generally speaking, redo it. They don't mind revising, they don't mind altering slightly. The only constraint really is how much time is there, can we be bothered? And film, because I handled it as an editor and loading it into the camera, I knew that each shot that we made was irrevocable. Every shot was once it was made, it was always going to be the same. It's not subject to revision. It's a recording after all. So these dancers, on the other hand, would be hanging around waiting to do another take, and they would do as many takes. They're amazing, actually. Their stamina and commitment is extraordinary. So they're always available for revision. They're standing by. They represent a kind of infinite possibility because they will and can do anything. So I saw them as kind of their bodies very quickly came to me to be seen to be like storehouses, infinite storehouses, and all future moves were stored magnificently in them, and they would wait, and it was fantastic, that sense of potential, which of course a piece of film doesn't have because it's a defined quantity. I resigned myself to the meagre store I would have when starting to edit. You're always depressed by, you just look at it and your usual response straight away is, I've got nothing, there's nothing there, it's ridiculous. So you always feel like you're starting from a position of failure there. However, there's a further degradation of material because you exhaust possibilities by discarding as well as a filmmaker. So you end up with even less than the nothing you first looked at. But, on the other hand, I'm also aware that for every shot there is another shot. There are other takes. There are different relationships that can be made between the material you've got. So there's a kind of community of the imaginary set of relationships. There's a community of slightly adjusted shots, of loosened or tightened. And then there's the multiplicity as well of the shots that you wanted to have done, but that you wish you'd done, but hadn't. And they're always with you, even when you're kind of, sometimes if some years pass, you kind of forget, but while you're working on a film, there's an incredible community of this sort of stuff. But nothing would ever be quite as magnificent as the dancer themselves. So that was something that was quite powerful for me at the time. So as a filmmaker, of course, you can't do literally anything. You have to kind of have a regime. So you start shooting, you have to make a plausible plan about what you're going to do. And then you try and imagine a pathway through all these possibilities as you're shooting the film, because the imagined pathway defines what you come to shoot later the day or the next day. Also, what plausible edits you could make with what you think you've got, what you might have, and what you could plausibly shoot that would help with that. So you're making a kind of path through all this material. I don't see it as having much to do with time, because time is something that comes later, I guess. In the practical situation, being confronted with filmmaking, you're more or less trying to accumulate a set of facts, as it were, or kind of quantities that you can work with. And you're looking for connections that might be plausible and work between them in this huge jumble of material that you've got. some of it actual, some of it imaginary, some of it yet to be realised. Just to illustrate, just maybe helpful, I don't know, I was thinking about multiple camera shoots. A lot of people think, oh, well, if you want to film a piece of dance, you just put cameras at different positions, you run them all, and then you go into the edit and you simply switch between different camera feeds and you end up with a dance film. Well, I have to say, unfortunately, that doesn't really work, because when you come to edit it, if you haven't got the cameras in good positions for that, it doesn't work. So you have to end up doing the kind of little adjustments that you would have to make with a single camera shooting. If you want to make it look like there's strict continuity, you have to do cheats. And actually, even with a multiple camera setup, you have to do cheats as well, which kind of proves my point that I don't know if you believe that, but it is that's what happens. I think it does bear on the point I was trying to make earlier on. I think it's about path, not the sequence. That's what I'm trying to say. The sequence of events in some imaginary time, called real time, I don't think that has much utility really to a filmmaker, I'm thinking. So, looking through the viewfinder, you're not just seeing the image in front of you, there's a kind of community of other images and scenes that you have to deal with. I think I ended up this section by saying the future and the past must coalesce into the present. So there we are, into the present. Okay, so going back to Astaire and Charisse and that lovely moment in their film, I think what I really was delighted by really was this chance to be on the edge of what you might call the real and the unreal, the here and the there. Screen space is obviously very intriguing, and we think about it constantly. We want to understand its mysterious kind of power. And that moment when they break from walking into dancing, for me, helps really illuminate, for me, that really quite mysterious phenomenon. And what I liked about it when they start to dance is as a filmmaker, you sort of think that suddenly you don't have to worry about this illusion of spontaneity that so much of cinema is constantly trying to get, is the illusion that everything that's happening on screen is spontaneous. Of course, when people are dancing, it is a kind of image of spontaneity, but a kind of heavily, it's one we know and understand that it's not really spontaneous, but it's just absolutely delicious for me. And the other thing I did want to say about dance, and I want to salute the dance world, is because of the absolute seriousness and high-mindedness of the dance world, as I found it. I thought it was such a refreshing change from so much of the people I hung around with from the film world. Their sense of history, their sense of significance, their taking absolutely seriously the idea of discipline, technique, their framing of what they do in historical terms, in a truly international kind of sensibility. I have to say that was such a total joy. And when I started coming to know much more about dance, I mean, coming across Yvonne Rainer, but no manifesto for me was I just jumped up to cheer. I just thought, how fabulous! If only somebody in the film world had that wit and intelligence. Really, that would be marvellous. Despite Godard, who I'm afraid never quite rises to the No Manifesto. No to trash imagery, no to camp, no to the seduction of the spectator by the wiles of the performer. What can you say? The other thing about making films with dancers is you can get really close to the action without having to worry about what anyone's thinking, which is quite an amazing permission. It's just we're there for the dance. And it's the potential of the human body as well, not as an object, at all. You're there with an infinitely marvellous set of possibilities, and it's just like watching a flower open. It's just brilliant. A dancer's body is not, it's just not it's not an earthly thing in that way. I was going to say something about Bresson's idea of model, but I don't think I will. And also dancers, the other thing which I do love is that film has been, it's not very good at this, but in dance, the very musical concept of rest is given incredible weight, and it's possible to actually work with that as a quantity, as something you want to value. Which filmmaking, I'll come back to it later, I think, a little bit, but I just so much of the time spent editing out what are deemed to be dead moments or pauses or flat bits, and that seemed always kind of such a terrible kind of constraint. So the other thing is that I think the other marvellous thing about working with dance was this, the fact that cinema, certainly since the talkies came, favours the head, and it's of course the head that speaks, the head that has facial expressions. The close-up, the human space, the human face speaking or reacting to speech is kind of the unit of film currency. There are a few exceptions. I was going to sort of... has everybody seen Pickpocket, Robert Bresson, the scene? If you haven't, everybody must have done in a company such as this. Well, to me, that was, that's kind of like manna in the desert. There's so few filmmakers who did for these neglected body parts, hands in Bresson's case. It's a beautiful thing, and he overturns this traditional hierarchy of body parts so beautifully and so reverently. His tenderness for the material is so great, but not many filmmakers like him. I probably guess that anyone who doesn't love the Robert Bresson sequence probably doesn't really have much interest in dance, I think. I suppose the problem is, though, is dance. Obviously, we've touched on this thing that you film it and then it's not live anymore, so it must be dead. So I suppose that must mean that a dance film is some kind of reliquary of human potential, a mausoleum, with all these departed, sad gestures, rehearsed while the machine runs forever. Uncannily animated. It's a ghastly shadow play, and its absence is the absence it invokes is just too painful to contemplate. So is watching dance film going to be a forlorn and terrible business? Of course, filmmaking is a practical matter, so you have a camera in a room and you've pointed at somebody dancing, and then there you are, you've got a film. Yes, you're hoarding up the past, you're going to try and bring to the present aspects of the past, and deliver the past into the future, and you can even be quite reverential about the human gesturing and behaviour and dancing that you're showing. I think it's true to say we can never get enough of that. Hoarding is quite compulsive. Documentation is an obsession for our race. So there must be some level at which it's not too forlorn a practice. I think, there was a moment when I almost said filming upholds the world, to use that famous idea. But I think it certainly reminds us, or presents back to us, the potential of the human body, which is something that we need to believe in for our own spiritual purposes, I would imagine. And the hoarding that I was going to be embarking on would be to create this incredible community of takes and retakes, angles and shots, and the infinite variety that I've mentioned. And some of them that would be real, and a lot of them would have never been achieved because we ran out of time or the shots just weren't as envisaged. So there would be an extraordinary vast community here, ready and available, certainly when editing, but actually coexisting for all time for me. They're like a kind of silent army of curious, kind of bodies clustering around the film as it emerged, and staying there with me as the years pass and memories even fade. I have to say, just to prove that point, there's apparently quite a lot of people who ring up television stations when films are on to complain about missing sequences that have been deleted, edits that have been made, or censorship. And actually, these are people who are complaining about sequences that never existed. But they're absolutely firmly committed to them. They love them, and they're most treasured moments from films, except that they were never made. So I think it proves that for all of us, this is a constant. There's not only the actual film, there's the imaginary film. And then there's, if you add them all together, I mean, what kind of a film would you get? It's amazing. So this swirling round of angles and shots and moments gathered around the work in progress and the work as it travels through time into the future. And also the sense that every time a dancer does something, they kind of close off possibilities, but on the other hand, there are echoes of other possibilities, of things that might have been. I never saw dancers as being alone, and I never saw them as forlorn. There's this giant community. On the theme of statuary, I've always loved going to museums where they have these rooms stuffed full of plaster cast replicas of statues, and because they're regarded as worthless because they're replicas, they pack them in. And I'm sure you've all been to galleries. There was one in was it Vienna, and then the curators got to work and spaced everything out and removed a lot of things to storage and made it tasteful. But there was a marvellous time when they were just packed in there, and you could just wander through all these kind of limbs and arms, and many of them with missing limbs and missing arms. I couldn't find a picture of that place. The only one I could find online when I thought of this was the Whitney has a room like that. So the other thing about I mentioned silence is generally regarded as completely terrifying to filmmakers. Obviously, silence and the falling of silence is obviously death, as we know. And in fact, I used to be, for some years, I was an editor in current affairs in the BBC. And when you produced a piece of film that would go off for transmission, if there was any silence in it over 4 seconds, you had to produce a memo. This is pre-photocopies and emails. And you would have to type out this memo saying, warning, silence. And then I think 20 copies went to 20 different places, including the transmission facilities in the country. And they would have to be warned that there was silence coming, and it was so dangerous. So then otherwise, there was an automated system to put up a caption apologising for the silence. So obviously, and then when you were editing interviews, you would always go through and you would look for all the silence and you'd edit that out assiduously, and if anyone spotted any silence, you would undoubtedly be all over the coals. The anxiety is colossal around silence. So I was leaving that kind of world. I was leaving that kind of a world and coming into another kind of world where silence wasn't going to be treated with such suspicion. And then, so I was able to, I think the very first thing I did with Jonathan actually was the reason why we got asked to make the second film that I'll show you a tiny clip of in a minute, because I went to Passages of Black, and my original thought was to register, truthfully, lapses of attention that I experienced when watching dance, or kind of moments when I was thinking about something else and wasn't focused on it, or moments when I just thought, well, I've had enough of that, so I'll just go to a black screen for a while until I'm ready for some more, because if it gets too rich, then you might. So Jonathan loved those and called them visual silences, and in fact he incorporated such silences into his own work. And if you have ever seen a thing called Stop Quartet of his, there are moments when the dancers stop, and those stops are the silences, the stops, but he intended them as visual silences, choreographic silences. And actually it became, I never stopped doing it because I like it. I think it's a good way to kind of work with the material and to reflect, truthfully, an aspect of watching dance that can't be, a choreographer can't give an audience anything which is to do with how the audience sees the dance that they're watching, but a film can. So I thought, well, I'll just register honestly something I'm dealing with there. Of course, the other thing is coming into the dance film world, I suddenly, this kind of, what I was able to indulge in was this modernism's love affair with silence, of course. The act of the move to silence and withholding, speaking in ever quieter voice until no one can hear and everybody's straining to hear. It was kind of, you could see that as an aggression against the audience, which perhaps might be a good thing. Perhaps the audience needs more aggression. Too many people trying to please them, I think. But it was a good thing because it meant that, as I say, it was treated as something to work with, as valid as anything else. So whilst to cut to black, you could say, was a nasty thing to do. On the other hand, I felt it was part of my project to make something visible. And, of course, then I could always point to John Cage and say, well, look, he says there's no such thing as silence. Silence can be noisy in his marvellous way of speaking. So blackouts and silence are very much part of what I see as the possibility that a filmmaker coming into dance suddenly finds available. And if there was any risk of causing displeasure, well, actually the dance audience, the audience in the dance world of dance film, were quite happy with being displeased. They, a lot of choreography, contemporary work is not averse to displeasing people. So it was the idea they'd be quite intrigued by it. In fact, I went with a dancer to go and see Insulting the Audience, and of course it would be a dancer who took me to see Insulting the Audience because they would understand that. Nobody in the film world, it seemed to me, would be remotely interested in insulting the audience, which is obviously a disaster for film. So absence, of course, and I have to say my favourite story of all time is an old one. In 63 BC, Pompey entered Jerusalem and heard of the great treasure that the Jews had in the Holy of Holies. So he demanded to be taken there, brushed aside the veil, and found himself in an empty room. And I think it's a marvellous early modernist masterstroke that all the rabbis were obviously incredibly smart. So I think, there was a moment, no, I think I'll drop that bit. So I think it's probably good to come back to that Gorky thing. I said I had a good quote about absence and ghostliness. His review said, "It seems as if these people have died and their shadows are being condemned to play cards in silence into eternity." It's in a review called Last Night I Was in the Kingdom of Shadows. So that absence and ghostliness and deathliness, all quite sort of stimulating part of what working with dance suddenly became available and of interest. And there's the other thing, of course, which is that there's this kind of interesting thing about animation, which is, of course, you have all these still frames we know about, and then you move them through a machine and you have movement. And this aspect of kind of spectre and coming to life, this uncanniness is really ingrained in cinema's history. And in particular dance, the connection with dance on film and this. There's the Disney 1929 skeleton dance film, which I mean is still delightful now. And Michael Jackson updated that really brilliantly, and you know, skeletons dancing. I mean, there's all sorts of fantastical, you know, kind of things you can say about it, about, you know, the kind of particular American story around race and the history of race in America. But there is also this aspect of the macabre aspect of dancing, and dancing as a kind of automated, compulsive, uncanny movement when really you know it shouldn't be happening, that it's just still images. So how the hell does that work? Gorky, I think it's all good, and silence. When silence and darkness come in these films, which, you know, is a permission to work with that sort of material, it was such a delight. But, you know, what I discovered was, you know, actually in the darkness, of course, there's something about the essence of cinema, something primal, something lightless, something wordless, and of course then the light returns, and it's that return of light that I find always astonishing, and it seems a shame to me that many other kinds of filmmaking don't allow themselves that, to have that as part of the fabric of their work. So I think visual silences in this way can facilitate seeing rather than just looking, and that was a fabulous thing for me. Going back to this idea of painting, I'd like to link making dance to filmmaking. I think it's a part of still life. If it's image making of any kind, I think it's still life rather than portraiture. Portraiture is a painting about, you know, portraits of people standing there, you know, in their clothes, whatever, or reclining naked, whatever. But still life to me is a fantastic thing. It's what a kind of an odd project is it? Portraiture seemed to me to, you know, dragged me back into the world of narratives, power relations, social life, life outside the frame. Still life, however, as an idea, takes me into, it's a reflective kind of an image making. It takes me into the picture, and it seems to, you know, for me, it's really kind of, it does seem really quite much more compelling as an idea of how is film, and in particular how will dance film work for me. So obviously with still life you've got the paradox, you're representing these vegetables and whatever and dead hairs on tables as vividly as you possibly can. So, you know, you have the feeling if the painter's done their work well, you could reach out and touch them. But of course, you know, they're actually all dead, it's still life. And even the painting in itself is inert and is just pigments on a surface anyway. I don't think portraiture would play those sorts of games. I think it would be experienced as a kind of insult. I quite like the word insult, it seems useful. And still life is really very much about organising the sequence of your looks, how you look. It seems to make us, it seems to be really intrigued by how we look. And I think and it wants us to think about that quite overtly. I think, I read somewhere a long time ago, and I can't find the source, but somebody said still life is never insistent, and I think that's, but I do think it is very beguiling. So, and obviously when you're making films with actors and you're making drama or whatever, trying to, as I did one time, it's all about making the semblance of life, yes, so it's that, you have to get the light, the settings, the interactions, everything is about plausibility, but then how is it going to be different coming into dance? I think actually it's because when I looked at it, it said they have no sense of purpose to me. that's right. But if they do, then it started to look like there was some kind of ritual purpose, if any. They might be acolytes of some bizarre religion. These movements that they perform in, presumably significant to someone. Somebody would be able to decode them. And they would seem to work often. Rarely was there a solitary dancer, and they seem to be like often collectives. And if they never collided, how did that happen? And if they did make contact, it was in very precise ways. And it seemed like they were kind of appeasing someone or something, and they could repeat it ad nauseum, if you like. And there were rarely words, so it would be silent. And if there were some words, they would be very patterned, and they certainly didn't seem to be bothered about communicating anything to anyone or getting a response. So I'm looking at these freeze frames and thinking, God, look at these statues, inert, immobile, frozen in time. Sometimes through framing you would cut off heads and limbs and arms and legs, so you'd end up with kind of torsos. So that the sense of statuary kind of is quite complete. I'd have all these different views as well, as if I was walking in among them. So, as I said earlier on, multiplicity, frozen, absolutely. And then, of course, what brings them to life, like with the skeleton dance, the filmmaker switches on the projector or whatever, and all of a sudden you've got this clattering medium going through. I'm going back to film. That's okay. And just a little sidelight on the Tony Hunter thing. I think it seemed to me always that dancers don't have names. So Gabrielle Gerard and Tony Hunter disappear, as do all the dancers I ever worked with. They were their real names. And the idea that they have character names seems important down the line that they don't have that. So the pleasure of dance film was that it was not going to be naturalism. It was not an illusionistic sort of project. And it had this aesthetic space which was established by their movement and their presence. And for that reason it felt very modern to me, and I liked that. What was outside the frame seemed kind of unnecessary to fret about. It was about making these concrete frames, and that was a joy. So of course it goes without saying that they have no names, nor do they have responsibilities. There are no consequences flowing from anything like that. So really kind of special kind of presence on screen, quite unusual. Anyway, they didn't seem to have particularly material bodies to me on screen. I'm seeing them as kind of disembodied in an odd sort of way. Yes. If you drop that bit. Yes. Going back to still life. I did actually think that, I mean, I always loved painting, but so I sort of had two paintings, one by a Spanish sort of ultra-realist painter and one by Caravaggio. I don't know if it makes any difference to sort of see paintings, but it just illustrates here's the, where is it? This is that's a sort of still life painting of the kind I looked at a lot, and then there's Caravaggio, which is a very different kind of painting, and it's just to show really that this idea of coming towards you or receding into the picture, into the frame. The Khotan is plausible. It represents a really good glimpse into his larder, and we can see the vegetables he's got in there. I don't know why he wants to show us, but he does. He's obviously a kind of painter who became a priest in Spain after all, so it's very sober painting, and it's, we're supposed to look at these humble vegetables and and there we are, there they are. His skill is undeniable, and he wants to take us to reality, to the sort of, to the absolute humble reality. It's kind of like, it's bathos of a kind. And the Caravaggio, which I think is, in a way, of course, we look at it and we love that more immediately, really. Obviously, the apple is famously worm-eaten. And Caravaggio is such a great painter that he can show us this kind of rotting, an image, a hyper-realistic image of fruit. But I don't think he's that bothered about reality. That's not his project. It's his artist's gesture of presentation that we see and we enjoy. Well, I do anyway. And I think that's really how dance sort of on film works for me. I think I had laboured to do Catan type images and films, and then all of a sudden dance meant I had this permission to explore this kind of a project. And I think Astaire in his dancing, he loves to hover between those two worlds, and that's why he's so great, because he knows there's that edge, and he loves, and that's why the walk in the park is so good, because he knows quite exactly what he's doing. I think he's in charge of that, and he loves to just walk riskily on that edge. So I'd say I just want one thing, having said how much I love the world of dance and its high-minded seriousness, but I did also want to say that film, is a very important possibility for dance, to frame it, to record it, to commemorate it. And so the relationship between the filmmaker and the dance is an incredibly charged one. So when you're making films, everybody is absolutely, totally committed, and it is quite extraordinary. There's no sniggering, really. Regular filmmaking is quite full of terrible sort of, sometimes it's very hard to keep people on track. But with dance, dance is very aware of what film can do for it, and what it wants to do for film, and it's a very important, and I'd say quite a ceremonial encounter, and really quite special. And especially since many of the dancers that I worked with, their complete concern with what happened in Judson Church, they were none of them old enough to be there. All they've got are some film records and documents. So their love and what they've inscribed onto these films is extraordinary. The supercharge around film for dance is quite immense. And the other thing I did want to say, because of this encounter, this special moment, I think I've always been quite. I've seen what's happening, the dance that will be done in order to make a film. I've always felt like I'm in the presence of work, not play. And even if there's improvisation, it always has this absolute work-like quality. And then always is the presence there of the technique, and it is hard won. Often contemporary dance is often barefooted, and you can see on the feet of many contemporary dancers, the kind of evidence of years of point shoes, despite the fact that they're doing barefoot, and their bodies as well are changed by the discipline. So these movements as well, they're movements which are made possible by technique and discipline, but they're also technique and discipline that is undertaken in order to achieve those movements, and then the movements themselves have an extraordinary quality. So I look at them, but it's the same for me as when I watch. I don't know if you see those Phil Niblock films of work where he's gone around the world for years and years and years filming people doing work. So it'll be people ploughing soil, or people weaving baskets, or people doing repetitive hard work jobs. And these films are marvellous in that there's a similar quality in people who've undertaken arduous work. often for a lifetime. So these hands and bodies and arms and shoulders and the practice skill and the competence and the poise is a very special material to work with as a filmmaker. And often the wordlessness as well lends an incredible gravity to. And then the other thing that's pleasurable about dancers is you can give them tasks. You can say, cross the room over and over again until I tell you to stop, and they will actually do it. There's no one else who will undertake this, so you can indulge in things of incredible tyrannies. A dancer on screen, there are no possessions. I think with Astaire and Cherise, the idea of possessions is preposterous. So that's nice, so you didn't have to worry about feeding them or giving them anything. They didn't need anything. They absolutely, completely... Hands. I think it seemed like a good idea to just try and talk about the two films showing tonight are two films that were commissioned for television. So as a result, the production values are quite ambitious. All the other filmmaking was done with money that the Arts Council would never fund filmmaking for the dance film as such. So I could never go to them and say, oh, I want to make a film with Jonathan, will you give me some money? They wouldn't do that. So we would have an enormous stationery budget in his annual Arts Council application. And there would, at the end of the year, there would be no stationery, but there would be a film, which didn't seem wrong. But on this occasion, we have two films. One of them was made for a slot in the Strand called Dance for the Camera, which the BBC established. And to their credit, they put them out in prime time, and they gave you reasonable amounts of money to do it. In the batch that I was in, they didn't really want anyone to make films anymore. So I had to find a way of proving to them that it would be cheaper to shoot film on 35mm than on Beta SP. And actually I was able to make the film more cheaply on 35mm. And the only way to do it was to have this bizarre thing so this is one reason to do the film this way, was to have no cuts, so that the film would just be one thing. We bought enough film stock for 8 takes, and then we would do as many takes as we wanted, but we wouldn't be able to print all of them because we didn't have enough money. So we could only print 2 to have a look, because you have to print it with film, you have to print it to have a look. So we knew that if something went wrong, and if you see the film tonight, you'll see that in a way it's an extraordinary kind of demanding technical challenge to achieve it. Then you wouldn't print it, but if you thought it was okay, then you could tick it. And so we did end up with 2 that seemed okay, and one of them was turned out to be better than the other for reasons that we still don't quite understand. But as it happens, all the film stock was ruined on the first shoot because there was a fault with the camera, which didn't become apparent until we printed the 2 takes. So actually what you'll see is we had to set up everything all over again and build the sets from scratch all over again. And so what you see is in fact the second shoot, which is quite strange. And just to say that because we had to do this in one shot in order to do it on 35mm, because we thought that would be important. Not quite sure why really now. We decided we had to have a way of delivering. It had to be a collaboration. That was the condition of the commission, and we had to be able to deliver it, 5 minutes in length, 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and so the only way to do that was to score it. So I had years ago I did mathematics at university, and in mathematics there's this nice concept called mapping. So if you had a set of values in one field and you couldn't work out a way how to do a calculation with them, you could map into a different field where you did know how to do calculations of values, and then you would map back and see what the answer is. So that was strategy in mathematics. So it seemed like a very good way to collaborate, and it proved to be very good. So a composer could write a score with a series of values, a rhythmical score, and a choreographer could devise a set of gestures, and then we could just simply map gestures to the score, to the note values, as it were. Is it time to stop? And there we are. How long before I should... Can I show a clip?
Let's look at the clip.
Is it up there? Just one, while it's on, I won't have the sound on. The set, by the way, is inspired by The Space Under My Chair by Bruce Nauman, which is a cast of the space under his chair. And because we were... What's going on? Why is it? It's not going on. No.
Is it already open?
Ah, there it is, up there. Oh no, stop. You want to play? No. This is the very beginning of it. So you go. So it's like a space in negative Nauman, and then is Jonathan, and his gestures are, he didn't know what the score was going to be, he just devised the gestures, and then he was presented with the score, and he simply remembered what each gesture was, and matched it to the thing, and then went through it. And then in fact the music is in counterpoint to the gesture of the score. So that was Hands, very expensive, and it goes on like this for 5 minutes. Show just Hands. I was going to just finish off with where did the idea of this come from? Well, have you ever seen these sorts of things in this sort of thing? These are commemorative, and this whole idea of film as a kind of memorial medium, and with a score in text, which is a kind of life of the person, and these memorial carvings, lots in the Roman world and Greek world, and these figures are always sort of seated, and they're always doing this with their hands, or there's always some gestural thing. And I sort of thought, well, actually, there's a kind of juxtaposition of physical presence with kind of like some kind of code presence, which I thought the film could combine rather beautifully. And then the other thing I did want to say is the other film, which is on tonight, which, if not everybody's seen, is this one with Sylvie Guillem, which I mentioned, which was expensive television. Oh, come on. This is very weird, isn't it?
It's behind.
It's
behind
down,
the thing.
No, but it's down at the bottom. If you go down to the bottom, just to the left,
Ah,
the window there. Yeah.
Sorry, there. So she's seen through a door. The whole film is shot through a door. It's sort of the equivalent of, there is dips to black all the way through it and up, coming back to the light. The other love I have is of forest glades, and and that passage from dark into light, which I think a forest glade gives you. I remember as a child there was a Tennyson poem about a forest glade. It's infused with a rather repellent religious kind of meaning in the Tennyson poem, but there's a description of the passage from light into dark, which I love. And the essence of cinema seems to me, if nothing else, kind of the constant delight in the passage from dark into light, so, as in encountering a glade. And the other thing is just the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which is, so these memorial things are often put inside these architectural sort of niches, which seem to me exactly like a film frame. There seemed to be a need to sort of somehow frame them. So that's that. Gesturing. Oh dear. Glades, I've mentioned glades. Dancers cleaning the floor, just to prove how much the space... I've noticed a lot of dancers when they go into a space to perform or to rehearse, they often get a mop and bucket and clean the space, and which I've always wanted to I thought somebody should make a film of dancers cleaning the space before they actually dance, which seemed to me kind of, I suppose, a bit like a stair, moving from not dance to dance.
I think we might have to stop.
And that's it.
Sorry,
I think that's it, really. Sorry.
Wonderful, thank you.